Okay, so we're going to look at the Song of Songs today, and then, Lord willing, next Tuesday we will look at Job as we make our way through the writings here. So, the Song of Solomon, this book, the first words are the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And in the construction, the grammatical construction that Solomon has chosen, you can hear in Song of Songs something similar to what you have in Holy of Holies. And if you think about Solomon and what the Bible tells us about him, we know from the book of Kings that he composed something like 3,000 songs. So for him to label this one the Song of Songs, what he's asserting by that title is that this is his best song. And this title also tells us that this book is one song, not a series of isolated or disconnected poems, but it is one unified production that Solomon regarded as his best. And it's impossible that Solomon would not have been aware of the similarity between this grammatical construction, the Song of Songs, and the construction at work in the phrase Holy of Holies. And then when you look at what's in this song, what you have is a king who is named as Solomon, and he is overcoming barriers to intimacy, and he's overcoming hostility and alienation to renew the oneness between himself and his bride, and where this is located and the imagery that's used, it's located often, or at least at its most intimate moment. You're in a garden. Let me just draw you to some statements here. Look at Song of Songs 4, verse 12. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A spring locked, a fountain sealed. So you can see that this is a garden, it's a private garden, and there's exclusive access to this garden. It's almost as though he's suggesting, I think it is as though he's suggesting, that the most intimate experience possible between a man and wife is like entering into the Garden of Eden. And so when you put this into the symbolic universe that the Old Testament provides for us, to enter into the Holy of Holies, to enter into the Garden of Eden is like entering into God's presence in the temple in the most holy place. And what I would encourage you to do is to take a concept like this and to order your thinking about human sexuality in accordance with that. So we should get our ideas of the most intimate acquaintance possible between a man and a wife from the Bible, not from the internet, not from movies, not from soap operas, not from novels, not from anything that the world supplies to us. We should get our thinking about this from the Scriptures. And if we do, then we have these questions like, how would I think about this if I were in the very presence of God, in the most holy place? How would that alter my desires? How would that alter my conduct? How would that alter the way that I felt about what's going on between a husband and a wife and their coming together in the kind of situation that we have described in the Song of Songs? So I think that Solomon intends to evoke some of these connotations, Garden of Eden connotations, Holy of Holies connotations, and he intends to provide an idealized picture that is to inspire and renew and teach what intimacy in marriage is supposed to look like. all of this that I'm saying assumes that the Song of Songs is not an engineering manual. In other words, this is poetry. And poets use poetry to evoke wider connotations. And in this poetry, I would suggest that in the same way that Hosea can present the relationship between himself and Gomer as a kind of allegorical depiction of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel, I would argue that Solomon is presenting the relationship between the king and the bride in the song as an allegorical depiction of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel. And whereas Hosea gives the negative side of this, the covenant's been broken, Solomon is giving the positive side of this. There's renewal possible, there's intimacy possible, there's glorious joy and beauty and a wonderfully good creation that God has made. And so, as he does this, I would submit that the king in the song, who is named Solomon, at points, well, I'll just look at chapter 3, verse 6. What is that coming up from the wilderness, like columns of smoke perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the fragrant powders of the merchant? Behold, it is the litter of Solomon. So the male figure in the song is Solomon. And yet I would argue that this is not meant to be a historical account of one of Solomon's marriages. Rather, it's an idealized account of an ideal Solomon who only has one wife. And in that, like Ecclesiastes, this is a statement of repentance from Solomon. This is a confession that God intended one man and one woman, and it's an acknowledgement, at least implicitly, that Solomon recognized that the way that he had handled himself with his 300 wives and 700 concubines, possibly hyperbolic numbers, but nevertheless, it's an account that, or it's a poem that acknowledges that is a perversion of God's good intention. So let me take you to 6:8, and this is one of the most when I first set out to study and preach through the Song of Songs and write on it, this text was one that scared me, but I'll give you my conclusion on it, and you can test everything and hold on to the good, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you think this is persuasive. Song of Songs 6:8. The king in the bride, whom I'm arguing is an idealized depiction of an idealized Solomon. He says this, he says in 6:8, there are 60 queens and 80 concubines. Now what he doesn't say is, I have 60 queens and 80 concubines. So a lot of people look at this verse and they think that it sort of reflects Solomon's many wives. I think if you acknowledge that it doesn't say, I have, then you can envision a scenario where King Solomon is saying to his only beloved, I know 60 kings, and we know the 60 wives of those queens, of those kings. And we know these other ladies who are concubines. So they exist. And then he goes on to say, and virgins without number. Verse 9, my dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, pure to her who bore her. The young women saw her and called her blessed, the queens and concubines also, and they praised her. And I would argue that if these are queens and concubines that belong to Solomon, this is not a very, this praise would not be well received by any woman, right? So, if your husband has all these other women, and he says, hey, I have all these other women, and you're my favorite. Well, thanks. That's really nice. But if, on the other hand, if he's saying, look, we're aware of all these other women, and you're the only one for me, well, and there's an exclusivity here, well, that's gonna communicate the devotion of the husband's love, and I would argue that's what's depicted here. So you can take that and test it and decide what you think about it. But my view is that Solomon is not saying, you are my favorite among all of my others, but rather the idealized Solomon, who is not the historical Solomon, is saying, yeah, there are these other women, and you're the only one for me. So, if we have an idealized Solomon, not the historical Solomon, many people look at this and they try to pinpoint it in the historical Solomon's life. I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's what we're meant to do with the poetry. I think what we're meant to do with the poetry is say, okay, this song, this poem, is about an idealized Solomon who is the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And in that regard, he is Yahweh's representative. He's the new Adam. He's the exemplary male. And then look at the way that he relates to his bride. And this example is supposed to be inspiring and instructive. So yes, it's supposed to help the rest of us plebes who aren't the king of Israel, but it's to inspire us to follow in the footsteps of the one true king of Israel, who does conduct himself the way that the idealized Solomon in the song conducts himself, which differs from the way that the historical Solomon conducted himself.